The annual St. Dunstan's church fete had begun with such promise that morning, the sort of golden September promise that makes one forget the inevitability of autumn. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, chairwoman of the parish council, and a woman who approached charitable endeavours with the strategic mind of a field marshal, had surveyed the village green at 9:30 with considerable satisfaction. The white marquees stood crisp and expectant in the morning light, their guy ropes taut as violin strings. Bunting fluttered between the ancient elm trees in cheerful defiance of the pewter clouds gathering on the horizon, and the various stalls, from Mrs. Pembroke's legendary jam-preserve display to Colonel Weatherby's military memorabilia, presented themselves with the dignified readiness of soldiers on parade. Miss Jane Marple, who had arrived in Upper Thornfield 3 days prior to visit her great-niece, found herself a comfortable folding chair beneath the generous shade of the parish notice board. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, containing a half-finished bed jacket in soft blue wool, though her needles remained idle as she observed the gentle choreography of village life unfolding before her. There was something infinitely soothing about a church fete, she reflected, the way people revealed themselves so unconsciously when engaged in the serious business of charitable competition. She noted, with the sort of attention that appeared entirely casual, how Mr. Reginald Thornbury, the recently widowed owner of Thornfield House, lingered overlong at the cake stall, not from any particular interest in Victoria Sponge, but because it afforded him an excellent view of Mrs. Vivian Cartwright, who was arranging cut flowers with the sort of studied grace that suggested an awareness of being observed. Mrs. Cartwright, a handsome woman of 40-odd years, who had arrived in the village 6 months earlier, claiming to be writing a book on cottage gardens, possessed the kind of carefully maintained beauty that spoke of London salons and expensive face creams, rather an unusual background for someone supposedly devoted to rural horticulture. The morning progressed with the measured pleasantness of a Bach invention, each voice entering at its proper moment. The Reverend Dr. Hartwell, a scholarly man whose sermons on theological minutiae had been known to reduce even the most devout parishioners to gentle slumber, moved among his flock with nervous energy, clearly anxious that the weather should hold. His wife, a practical woman who managed both the parish accounts and her husband's tendency toward absent-mindedness, counted the takings from the White Elephant store with the concentration of a bank clerk. Young Dr. Marcus Fielding, newly arrived to take over old Dr. Pemberton's practice, had volunteered to oversee the children's games, though Miss Marple observed that his attention seemed more focused on Miss Sarah Thornbury, Reginald's daughter, who was managing the bookstall with the sort of earnest efficiency that made her father beam with paternal pride. There was something touching about the way the young doctor found excuses to consult with Miss Thornbury about perfectly straightforward matters, whether the ring toss should be moved to avoid the elm's shadow, whether the lemonade needed more sugar, the sort of transparent stratagems that made Miss Marple smile gently to herself. It was perhaps 20 minutes past 11 when the first drops began to fall, fat and warm and surprisingly gentle. Mrs. Ashworth looked up at the darkening sky with the expression of a general who has just received news of enemy troop movements, while the Reverend Dr. Hartwell began to make small, anxious sounds about moving the more delicate items under cover. But English weather, like English character, is not to be hurried, and what began as a gentle pattering soon developed into something altogether more determined. Within minutes, the scene had transformed from pastoral tranquility to barely controlled chaos. Ladies shrieked and laughed as they gathered their skirts and ran for the nearest marquee, while gentlemen attempted to maintain their dignity while shepherding children and salvaging cake stands. The bunting, so brave and bright moments before, hung in dejected loops, and the carefully arranged flowers began to droop like disappointed debutantes. Miss Marple, who had experienced enough sudden showers to know the wisdom of carrying a proper umbrella, regardless of the morning's promise, made her way with unhurried steps toward the main refreshment tent. As she walked, she could not help but notice the small drama playing out near the jam preserve stall, where Mr. Thornbury was gallantly offering his umbrella to Mrs. Cartwright, who accepted it with a flutter of gratitude that seemed rather practiced. Her own umbrella, a sturdy black affair with a distinctly masculine handle, remained furled at her side. Curious, perhaps, for a woman so apparently concerned with appearances. The refreshment tent, when Miss Marple reached it, buzzed with the particular energy that attends any gathering of English people forced into closer proximity than social convention usually allows. Conversations that had been conducted at proper distances were now necessarily intimate, and the usual careful politeness of village interaction gave way to something more revealing. She accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hartwell and found herself positioned near enough to the tent's entrance to observe the continuing exodus from the rain. It was then that she noticed the peculiar business with the umbrellas. A collection of them had been hastily deposited just inside the tent's entrance. Black ones, brown ones, one rather smart navy blue with a silver handle that clearly belonged to Colonel Weatherby. But it was the umbrella that Mr. Geoffrey Ashford carried that caught her attention. Mr. Ashford, a quiet gentleman of middle years who had taken rooms at the Rose and Crown some 3 weeks earlier, claiming to be researching local church architecture, had arrived at the tent looking distinctly flustered. His umbrella, a perfectly ordinary black one, bore a small but distinctive repair to its strap, mended with what appeared to be a length of blue ribbon tied in a neat bow. Miss Marple's eyes, which had grown sharp from decades of observing the small inconsistencies that reveal large truths, noted that Mrs. Cartwright glanced at Mr. Ashford's umbrella with what might have been recognition, though she gave no other sign of knowing the gentleman. More interesting still was the way Mr. Ashford's hand tightened on the umbrella's handle when Dr. Fielding approached, offering to take it with the others. "Thank you. No," Mr. Ashford said quietly. "I prefer to keep it with me. One can never be too careful with borrowed items." The word borrowed hung in the air with peculiar weight, though Dr. Fielding appeared not to notice anything amiss. But Miss Marple, whose ear was attuned to the subtle discordances in human conversation, filed the comment away with a sort of mental precision that had served her well in previous encounters with the darker aspects of human nature. The rain drummed harder on the canvas above, and someone remarked that it showed no signs of letting up. Mrs. Ashworth began to make cheerful noises about moving the afternoon's planned activities indoors, while Colonel Weatherby pronounced that in his day a bit of rain never stopped a proper English gathering. The tent filled with the comfortable sounds of communal endurance, the clink of teacups, the rustle of damp clothing, the murmur of voices making the best of unexpected circumstances. It was during this pleasant interlude that young Tommy Hartwell, the vicar's nephew, came pelting through the rain with a sort of urgent energy that immediately commanded attention. He burst through the tent flap, soaking wet and wide-eyed, and made straight for his uncle with news that would transform the day's gentle inconveniences into something altogether more sinister. "Uncle, you must come at once. There's been an accident, or something worse, in the old gardener's shed behind the churchyard. It's Mr. Ashford, and he's not moving, and there's blood, and his umbrella." The boy's voice cracked with the strain of his discovery. A silence fell over the tent that was far more profound than any caused by mere weather. Miss Marple set down her teacup with the sort of deliberate care that masked rapid thought, her eyes moving automatically to the spot where Mr. Ashford had been standing moments before. The space was empty, and the umbrella with its telltale blue ribbon was nowhere to be seen. The St. Dunstan's church fete had found its climax, though not at all the sort that Mrs. Ashworth had so carefully planned. As the first shocked exclamations gave way to the practical business of summoning the police, Miss Marple found herself reflecting that umbrellas, those most English of accessories, had a way of revealing far more about their owners than one might expect. And in a village where secrets seemed as common as morning mist, she suspected that Mr. Ashford's death would prove to be merely the first revelation in a much larger tapestry of concealed truth. The rain continued to fall, washing away footprints and perhaps evidence. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most important clues were often those that could not be washed away. The small inconsistencies in human behavior, the careful lies, and the desperate measures people took to protect the things they valued most. As the tent emptied and the serious business of investigation began, she remained in her chair, knitting needles finally moving in their familiar rhythm, her mind already beginning to sort through the morning's observations with the methodical patience of someone who understood that murder, like knitting, was usually a matter of following the pattern until the picture became clear. The discovery of Mr. Geoffrey Ashford's body sent ripples of shock through the gathered villagers that seemed to intensify rather than diminish as the news spread from person to person. Miss Marple, who had remained quietly in her corner of the refreshment tent, observed with a practiced eye of someone who understood that crisis reveals character more clearly than years of ordinary social interaction. The way people responded to sudden death, she had learned, often provided more insight into their true natures than months of polite conversation. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's immediate response was characteristically organizational. Within minutes, she had appointed herself coordinator of the crisis, dispatching volunteers to fetch blankets, direct traffic away from the churchyard, and ensure that someone telephoned for the proper authorities. Her need to maintain control in the face of chaos spoke to something deeper than mere efficiency. It was the reaction of a woman who could not bear to feel helpless, even in the presence of death. Colonel Weatherby, meanwhile, had assumed the role of military expert, holding forth to anyone who would listen about the tactical advantages of the shed's location and speculating about whether the attack had been planned or opportunistic. "Isolated spot," he pronounced with authority. "Perfect for an ambush. Whoever did this knew the ground." His words carried the weight of experience, though Miss Marple noted that his eyes kept straying toward the tent's entrance as if expecting someone who had not yet appeared. The arrival of Inspector Craddock from the county constabulary brought a welcome sense of official competence to the proceedings. A solid, methodical man in his 40s, he moved through the crowd with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. His preliminary examination of the scene was thorough but swift, and when he returned to question the witnesses, his manner was both respectful and penetrating. "I understand Mr. Ashford was last seen in this tent during the rain shower," he said, consulting his notebook. "Can anyone tell me exactly when he left and whether he mentioned where he was going?" The responses revealed the frustrating vagueness that often accompanies sudden events. Everyone remembered the rain beginning, the rush for shelter, the general confusion of people seeking cover. But the precise moment when Mr. Ashford had slipped away seemed to have passed unnoticed in the chaos. Dr. Fielding thought he might have seen him near the tent entrance around 11:25, but couldn't be certain. Mrs. Cartwright suggested he might have gone to retrieve something from his motor car, though no one could confirm this theory. Miss Marple found herself particularly interested in the reactions of those who claimed to have barely known the deceased. Mrs. Cartwright's composed grief seemed almost theatrical in its perfection, complete with delicate dabs of a lace handkerchief at eyes that appeared remarkably dry. Mr. Reginald Thornberry's protective hovering around his daughter struck her as slightly excessive for a man responding to a stranger's death, while young Dr. Fielding's medical assessment of the wounds had been delivered with the sort of clinical detachment that sometimes masks deeper emotional involvement. The matter of the umbrella continued to intrigue her. Inspector Craddock had confirmed that it was found beside the body, its distinctive blue ribbon repair intact, but somehow significant in ways that were not yet clear. The fact that Mr. Ashford had described it as borrowed suggested a story behind its possession, and Miss Marple's experience told her that borrowed items often carried complicated histories. Young Tommy Hartwell, when questioned more thoroughly about his discovery, provided additional details that painted a disturbing picture. The shed door had been slightly ajar, he reported, and Mr. Ashford had been lying just inside, as if he had either been struck down immediately upon entering or had crawled inside seeking help. The umbrella had been beside him, not dropped as if fallen, but placed with a care that seemed oddly deliberate for the scene of a violent crime. As the afternoon wore on and the police methodically documented the scene, the fete-goers gradually dispersed to their homes, carrying with them a mixture of shock, speculation, and the peculiar excitement that attends any disruption of routine. The theories multiplied with each retelling: robbery gone wrong, a quarrel with a stranger, even suggestions of romantic entanglements that seemed rather far-fetched for a quiet gentleman researching church architecture. But Miss Marple, gathering her knitting and preparing to return to her great-niece's cottage, reflected that the most dangerous assumptions were often those that seemed most reasonable. In her experience, murders in small villages were rarely the work of mysterious strangers or professional criminals. They were far more likely to spring from the tangled relationships and hidden grievances that lay beneath the surface of even the most peaceful communities. And the careful placement of that umbrella suggested a killer who was thinking clearly enough to arrange details, always a troubling sign in cases of supposedly sudden violence. The rain had finally stopped, but Miss Marple suspected that the storm it had brought to Upper Thornfield was only just beginning. The morning after the fate dawned with the peculiar clarity that follows violent storms, as if the rain had washed away more than mere dust from the village streets. Miss Marple, seated by her great-niece's cottage window with her knitting, observed that Upper Thornfield had acquired the hushed quality of a place holding its breath. The usual cheerful bustle of morning routines had been replaced by furtive glances and hurried conversations that ceased abruptly when strangers approached. Her ostensible errand to the post office provided the perfect opportunity to gauge the village's collective response to yesterday's tragedy. Mrs. Pembroke, who managed both the postal service and the most comprehensive network of local intelligence, greeted her with the eager expression of someone bursting to share significant revelations. "Such a dreadful business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Pembroke began, though her tone suggested excitement rather than genuine distress. "And the questions it raises about poor Mr. Ashford? Not that one wishes to speak ill of the dead, naturally, but there were aspects of that gentleman's behavior that didn't quite align with his stated purposes." Miss Marple selected her stamps with deliberate care, having learned that the most valuable information often emerged when one appeared only mildly interested. Mrs. Pembroke required no further encouragement to elaborate. 3 weeks he'd been at the Rose and Crown, claiming to research church architecture. Yet Mrs. Whitmore says he never once asked for directions to any of the historic churches in the district. Spent his time walking about the village, watching people, taking notes in a little leather book that's now mysteriously missing. Rather peculiar behavior for an architectural scholar. This intelligence aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's own observations of Mr. Ashford's conduct at the fete. His attention had seemed focused entirely on the villagers rather than on St. Dunstan's medieval stonework, despite his supposed professional interests. Furthermore, Mrs. Pembroke continued with obvious relish. He made several long-distance telephone calls from the private booth at the inn, always speaking in voices too low to overhear properly. But Mrs. Whitmore did catch fragments, something about confirming, arrangements, and the deadline approaching. Hardly the sort of conversations one expects from someone studying Norman church towers. The arrival of Dr. Fielding interrupted this fascinating recital. The young physician entered with uncharacteristic nervousness, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something more guarded. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he requested stamps for several letters, and the careful neutrality with which he responded to Mrs. Pembroke's inevitable questions about the deceased. "We exchanged pleasantries occasionally," he said with professional restraint. He seemed a quiet, scholarly gentleman working on historical research. But Miss Marple's practiced ear detected something evasive in his tone, a quality that suggested the doctor knew considerably more about Mr. Ashford than casual acquaintance would warrant. His description carried the weight of deliberate characterization rather than spontaneous observation. After Dr. Fielding's hasty departure, Miss Marple made her way toward the church, ostensibly to examine the damage to the bookstall. She found Sarah Thornbury conscientiously salvaging water-damaged volumes, tying the unsold novels with lengths of blue ribbon to prevent further deterioration. "Such a nuisance," Sarah remarked, holding up a sodden romance novel. "The rain has spoiled half our stock." "What lovely blue ribbon," Miss Marple observed with genuine admiration. "Such a practical solution." "I had 2 spools," Sarah replied absently, "but I gave Mrs. Cartwright a length just before the rain started. She needed to mend her umbrella strap and made such a dainty bow that even I had to admire her handiwork." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily in their rhythm. The connection between Sarah's ribbon and the repair on Mr. Ashford's umbrella was now unmistakably clear, though the significance of this link remained tantalizingly obscure. Mrs. Cartwright's request for ribbon, followed so closely by her acceptance of Mr. Thornbury's umbrella while leaving her own behind, suggested a level of preparation that extended far beyond mere concern for keeping dry. As she walked home through the village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the emerging pattern of deception and misdirection. Mr. Ashford had clearly been something other than the scholarly researcher he'd claimed to be, conducting surveillance rather than architectural study. His telephone calls about arrangements and deadlines suggested coordination with outside parties for purposes that had ultimately led to his death. Most significantly, the careful placement of that umbrella beside his body, with its telltale blue ribbon repair, indicated a killer who understood the importance of sending a specific message. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, such deliberate staging was never accidental, and the message was invariably intended for someone who would recognize its significance. The village might be eager to embrace theories of robbery or random violence, but Miss Marple suspected that Mr. Ashford's death was rooted in the complex web of relationships and secrets that lay beneath Upper Thornfield's tranquil surface. Inspector Craddock returned to Upper Thornfield with the methodical determination of a man who understood that murder investigations, like village secrets, required patient excavation. The morning mist clung to the churchyard with unusual persistence, as if the very air had thickened around the scene of violence. His examination of the gardener's shed revealed details that painted an increasingly complex picture of Mr. Ashford's final moments. The padlock bore faint scratches, suggesting it had been manipulated rather than properly unlocked, while inside, the careful arrangement of tools remained undisturbed except for the space where the body had lain. Most significantly, the umbrella found beside Mr. Ashford showed peculiar characteristics that troubled the inspector's orderly mind. Despite the previous day's torrential downpour, its silk fabric was barely damp, suggesting it had been placed there after the rain had ceased, a detail that transformed the scene from spontaneous violence to calculated staging. At the Rose and Crown, Mrs. Whitmore proved an invaluable source of intelligence about her deceased guest's behavior during his final weeks. Her observations painted a portrait of a man whose scholarly pursuits seemed oddly focused on contemporary village life rather than historical architecture. He asked the strangest questions, she confided to Inspector Craddock over morning tea. Not about Norman arches or medieval stonework, but about who lived where, how long families had been established, whether there had been recent arrivals or departures. Rather like a census taker conducting a very personal survey. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter when Colonel Weatherby, clearly wrestling with his conscience, approached the inspector with information he had initially withheld. His military bearing could not quite conceal his discomfort as he described seeing Mrs. Cartwright near the gardener's shed on the morning of the fete, carrying what appeared to be a gentleman's umbrella, while her own remained at her side. "Didn't think much of it at the time," the colonel admitted with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Cartwright has been most kind since my arrival, invited me for tea, listened to my stories about India, with genuine interest. Seemed ungentlemanly to cast suspicion on such a charming lady without absolute certainty. This revelation, combined with the discovery of Mr. Ashford's leather notebook hidden beneath loose floorboards in the shed, began to shift the investigation's focus dramatically. The notebook contained detailed observations about various villagers, their habits, financial circumstances, even fragments of overheard conversations. Most damaging was a specific entry. Wetherby, 1948, Kashmir incident, discrepancies in regimental accounts. By Wednesday afternoon, the evidence seemed to point inexorably toward Colonel Wetherby as the prime suspect. His legendary temper, the apparent blackmail attempt revealed in Ashford's notes, and witnesses to their heated argument outside the Rose and Crown created a compelling narrative of motive and opportunity. The village, perhaps relieved to have a clear explanation for the disruption of their peaceful existence, seemed eager to embrace this solution. Inspector Craddock found himself satisfied with the emerging case against the colonel, whose blustering denials and military indignation struck him as the reactions of a guilty man caught in an increasingly tight net. The theory was clean, logical, and supported by tangible evidence, exactly the sort of resolution that brought credit to methodical police work. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly unconvinced by the apparent clarity of the case. Her observations at the fete had revealed a different Colonel Wetherby, a man who enjoyed the performance of authority rather than its brutal application. His pronouncements about tactical advantages had carried the enthusiasm of a spectator, not the calculation of someone planning violence. Moreover, the precise nature of Mr. Ashford's death, followed by the careful placement of evidence, suggested a coolly controlled mind rather than the explosive temperament that characterized the colonel's public persona. Her attention returned repeatedly to the umbrella and its telltale blue ribbon repair. The bow that had mended the strap showed signs of hasty tying, uneven loops, carelessly trimmed ends, quite different from the neat, precise sample she had observed in Mrs. Cartwright's sewing basket. Someone had borrowed that umbrella, repaired it hurriedly, and then used it as a deliberate message in the staging of murder. As Inspector Craddock prepared to make his arrest, Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to direct suspicion toward convenient targets. The true killer, she suspected, remained hidden within Upper Thornfield's respectable facade, protected by the very eagerness of others to accept simple explanations for complex crimes. Human nature, in her considerable experience, was rarely as straightforward as police reports preferred to believe. The morning brought news that Inspector Craddock intended to arrest Colonel Wetherby within the hour, a development that found Miss Marple positioned strategically outside the Rose and Crown with her knitting bag and an expression of mild concern. When the inspector emerged from his consultation with the local constabulary, she approached him with the sort of gentle determination that had, in previous cases, prevented several miscarriages of justice. "Inspector Craddock," she said pleasantly, "I wonder if you might spare a moment before you see the colonel. There's a small matter about that umbrella that continues to trouble me." Craddock, who had learned to respect Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations, paused in his purposeful stride. "What sort of matter, Miss Marple?" "Simply this. When Mr. Ashford carried that umbrella into the refreshment tent, the blue ribbon repair was tied in a most elegant bow. Yet when poor Tommy found him, the ribbon was knotted quite carelessly, as if someone had retied it in great haste." She adjusted her spectacles thoughtfully. "People don't usually change their manner of tying knots, do they? Rather like handwriting, I should think." The inspector frowned, consulting his notebook. "You're suggesting someone else handled the umbrella after Ashford's death?" "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "that the umbrella found beside him wasn't the same one he carried into the tent." This possibility sent them first to Mrs. Cartwright's cottage, where they found the lady in question tending her roses with unusual intensity. Her greeting carried the sort of bright composure that Miss Marple had learned to recognize as carefully rehearsed charm. How dreadful about poor Colonel Weatherby, Mrs. Cartwright said, accepting their request for tea with apparent graciousness. Though I suppose one never truly knows people, does one? Miss Marple settled herself comfortably in the sitting room, noting the expensive furnishings that seemed oddly inconsistent with a writer's modest income. "Such lovely gloves," she remarked, indicating a pair of dove-grey kid leather gloves on the mantelpiece. "I had a pair just like them once, though I'm afraid I lost one in the most careless manner." Mrs. Cartwright's hand moved instinctively toward the gloves before she caught herself. How annoying that must have been. Good gloves are so difficult to replace. "Indeed, though I notice yours appear quite pristine, not like the poor damaged one young Tommy found near the gardener's shed this morning." Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but her eyes watched Mrs. Cartwright's face with sharp attention. The effect was immediate. Color drained from Mrs. Cartwright's cheeks before returning in a telltale flush. "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Inspector Craddock leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Cartwright, we understand you had several meetings with Mr. Ashford at the Rose and Crown. Mrs. Whitmore described them as business discussions. What sort of business might that have been?" The question hung in the air while Mrs. Cartwright struggled visibly with her response. Finally, she said, "Mr. Ashford was persistent in his inquiries about my background. He seemed to believe I wasn't entirely truthful about my reasons for coming to Upper Thornfield." "And were you truthful?" Miss Marple asked with gentle curiosity. Mrs. Cartwright's composure cracked entirely. "He was trying to blackmail me," she admitted. "He discovered that I wasn't really writing a book, that my name isn't actually Cartwright, and that I came here for personal reasons involving the Thornbury family." As they left the cottage, Miss Marple paused to examine the garden more closely. Beneath a rose bush, partially hidden by fallen petals, lay a small length of blue ribbon tied in an exquisite bow, far more precise and delicate than the hasty knot found on the murder weapon. "She's our ribbon expert," Miss Marple observed quietly to Inspector Craddock. "But she's also clever enough to know that her own careful handiwork would betray her, so she retied it clumsily, hoping to suggest masculine hands." Walking back toward the village center, Inspector Craddock found himself reconsidering the entire case. If Mrs. Cartwright killed Ashford to prevent exposure of whatever brought her here, why frame Colonel Weatherby? "Because," Miss Marple said, "a woman clever enough to assume a false identity and maintain it for 6 months would certainly be capable of adding a forged entry to Mr. Ashford's notebook. The Colonel made a perfect scapegoat. Military background, obvious temper, and just enough genuine secrets to make the blackmail motive believable." The Colonel's relief when informed that his arrest was postponed was palpable, though Miss Marple suspected that Mrs. Cartwright's real motives remained hidden beneath layers of deception that would require considerably more excavation to expose. The umbrella had provided the key to unraveling her careful plan, but the full truth of why she had come to Upper Thornfield and what connection she had to the Thornbury family still awaited discovery. The morning brought a peculiar stillness to Upper Thornfield, as if the village itself was holding its breath while Inspector Craddock reconsidered his assumptions. The revelation about Mrs. Cartwright's deception had shifted the investigation's focus entirely, leaving the inspector with the uncomfortable realization that his methodical approach had nearly led to arresting an innocent man. Miss Marple, who understood that the most significant truths often emerged through social calls rather than formal interrogations, suggested they pay a courtesy visit to Thornfield House to inform the family of recent developments. Reginald Thornbury received them in his study with the sort of nervous hospitality that immediately suggested guilty knowledge. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged chairs, and his usual hearty manner seemed forced and brittle. Sarah appeared pale and withdrawn, hovering near the doorway as if prepared for flight rather than conversation. "Dreadful business about Mrs. Cartwright," Thornbury said, though his tone suggested relief rather than genuine distress. One never knows who one's neighbors really are, does one? Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, her knitting bag at her feet, and allowed her gaze to wander apparently aimlessly around the room. The mantelpiece held an interesting collection of family photographs spanning several decades, including what appeared to be wedding portraits and formal family gatherings. One photograph in particular caught her attention. A wedding picture from perhaps 20 years earlier, showing a radiant bride whose bone structure bore a striking resemblance to their mysterious neighbor, despite differences in coloring and styling. "What a lovely bride," Miss Marple observed with innocent admiration. "Such an elegant woman. A family connection, I assume." The effect of her comment was immediate and telling. Thornbury's face flushed while Sarah made a small, involuntary sound of distress. "My late wife's companion," he said after a noticeable pause. "Miss Vivian Hale. She helped care for Eleanor during her final illness. A most capable woman." Inspector Craddock leaned forward with professional interest. "This companion. When did she leave your employment, Mr. Thornbury?" "Shortly after my wife's death," Thornbury replied carefully. "We had no further need of her services, and she expressed a desire to return to London. We heard nothing more from her until she appeared in Upper Thornfield as Mrs. Cartwright," Miss Marple completed gently. "How very interesting that she should choose to settle in this particular village, of all the places in England she might have selected." Sarah, who had been listening with increasing agitation, suddenly spoke up. "She had no right to come back here. Mother trusted her, and she took advantage of that trust in ways that were quite unforgivable." This outburst earned her a sharp look from her father, but Miss Marple's encouraging nod prompted her to continue. "There were financial irregularities," Sarah admitted reluctantly. "Mother's jewelry, some valuable pieces that went missing. We couldn't prove anything, but the timing of Miss Hale's departure was rather suspicious." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Fielding, who had come to check on Mr. Thornbury's blood pressure medication. The young physician seemed unusually subdued, and when Miss Marple inquired about his apparent low spirits, he confided his concerns about details he had observed at the fete. "I keep thinking about Mrs. Cartwright's behavior during the rain shower," he said, adjusting his medical bag nervously. "She seemed to be examining the umbrellas quite deliberately, as if looking for something specific. And when you offered yours, Mr. Thornbury, she accepted it so readily that I wondered why she hadn't simply used her own." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "How observant of you, Doctor. I noticed something similar myself. The umbrella she left behind had such a distinctive handle, quite masculine in design, with a small silver plate that might have been engraved." "Engraved?" Thornbury asked sharply. "Indeed, though I couldn't make out the inscription from a distance. Perhaps the initials of a previous owner?" Miss Marple's tone remained conversational, but her eyes watched Thornbury's face carefully. The revelation that emerged from Inspector Craddock's subsequent investigations painted an even more complex picture. Mr. Ashford, it transpired, was actually Geoffrey Ashton, a private investigator specializing in inheritance disputes and missing persons cases. His presence in Upper Thornfield had been commissioned by a London firm of solicitors handling a complicated trust matter involving the Thornbury estate. "There's a substantial trust fund involved," Inspector Craddock explained to Miss Marple as they walked back toward the village centre. "Established by Thornbury's father-in-law, with specific provisions about Sarah's inheritance. The funds are to be released when she marries or reaches 25, but only if certain conditions about the family's reputation and financial probity are met." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Mr. Ashton was investigating whether those conditions had been satisfied?" "Exactly. The trustees had received anonymous allegations about financial irregularities during Mrs. Thornbury's final illness. Missing jewelry, forged signatures on bank documents, that sort of thing. Ashton was hired to verify the facts before releasing what amounts to a considerable fortune." As they paused outside the post office, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of deception and desperation that was emerging. Mrs. Cartwright, or Miss Hale as she had once been, had clearly returned to Upper Thornfield with specific purposes in mind. Whether those purposes had extended to murder remained to be determined, but the careful staging of Mr. Ashton's death suggested a mind capable of both long-term planning and ruthless execution. The umbrella, with its precisely tied ribbon repair, had been intended as more than mere evidence. It was a message, though perhaps not the message that first appeared. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to manipulate not just evidence, but the very assumptions that investigators brought to their work. The truth, she suspected, lay somewhere in the tangled relationships between past and present, between the woman who had once been trusted with an invalid's care and the family whose secrets she had learned during those intimate months of service. And somewhere in that truth lay the motive for a murder that had been planned with a sort of meticulous attention to detail that spoke of both desperation and a chilling understanding of human nature. The morning after Inspector Craddock's revelations about Mr. Ashton brought an uncomfortable clarity to Upper Thornfield, like the harsh light that follows a storm and reveals all the damage previously hidden by darkness. Miss Marple, taking her customary walk through the village streets, observed that the residents moved with the careful deliberations of people who had suddenly become conscious of being watched. Conversations ceased more abruptly when strangers approached, and there was a general air of collective guilt that suggested the investigation had stirred more secrets than anyone had anticipated. The typewriter's tale, Inspector Craddock's methodical examination of the anonymous letter to the trustees, had yielded unexpected fruit. The document, typed on cheap paper with telltale irregularities, bore the distinctive marks of a machine with character, literally. The slightly elevated R and the chipped O created a fingerprint as unique as any human hand, and Mrs. Pembroke's excellent memory had provided the crucial connection to the parish fete programs from the previous year. The Thornbury typewriter, Inspector Craddock confirmed to Miss Marple as they sat in the Rose and Crown's private parlour. An old Underwood that Reginald keeps in his study for correspondence. The question is whether he typed that letter himself, or whether someone else had access to the machine. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. In my experience, Inspector, people often overlook the most obvious explanations. A typewriter in a family home is rather like the family Bible. Everyone assumes they know who uses it, but the reality is often quite different. Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah Thornbury herself, who appeared at the inn with a sort of determined composure that immediately suggested a prepared speech. She requested a private word with the inspector, and when granted it, delivered her information with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed every syllable. "I typed that letter," she said without preamble. "I sent the allegations to the trustees because I believed they needed to know the truth about my father's financial dealings during Mother's illness. I couldn't bear the thought of inheriting money that had been obtained through deception." Mrs. Cartwright's gambit. The revelation that Sarah had initiated the investigation added a new dimension to Mrs. Cartwright's return to Upper Thornfield. When confronted with this information, the former companion abandoned her pose of injured innocence and revealed the calculating mind that had orchestrated her elaborate deception. "I knew someone in the family had contacted the trustees," she admitted to Inspector Craddock. "When I learned about the investigation, I saw an opportunity to ensure that Reginald received the punishment he deserved. I tried to expose him years ago, but no one would listen to a dismissed servant making accusations against her former employer." Her confession painted a picture of systematic planning that was both impressive and chilling. She had established her false identity months in advance, researching the village and its inhabitants before making her carefully orchestrated return. The cottage rental, the story about writing a book on gardens, even her strategic friendship with Colonel Weatherby, all had been calculated moves in a complex game of revenge. "Mr. Ashton's arrival was unexpected," she continued. "When I realized he was investigating the same matters I had been pursuing, I thought we might work together. But he was suspicious of my motives, and he began asking uncomfortable questions about my own past. He threatened to expose my identity to the family before his investigation was complete. The artist's touch. But it was Dr. Fielding who provided the most disturbing revelation of all. His discovery of a small paintbrush near the refreshment tent, stained with traces of blue pigment, had initially seemed insignificant. However, Miss Marple's sharp eyes had noted its potential connection to Sarah's artistic pursuits, particularly her skill with miniature painting and delicate detail work. "I've been thinking about that umbrella repair," Dr. Fielding explained to the assembled investigators. "The blue ribbon was tied in two distinctly different ways. First, with a sort of precise decorative bow that speaks to artistic training, and then retied in a deliberately clumsy knot. It suggests someone who understood the significance of their handiwork and attempted to disguise it." Miss Marple examined the paintbrush with particular interest, noting not just the blue pigment, but the quality of the brush itself. Expensive, well-maintained, and bearing the subtle wear patterns of frequent use. "Such a delicate tool," she observed, "the sort one uses for the finest details, where precision is everything." The implications were troubling. If Sarah had indeed sent the anonymous letter that brought Mr. Ashton to Upper Thornfield, and if she possessed the artistic skills to create the elaborate staging around the umbrella, then her role in the investigation required serious reconsideration. Her apparent grief at the murder, her helpful cooperation with the police, her concern for her father's reputation, all might be the performance of someone far more calculating than anyone had suspected. The web tightens. As the day progressed, Inspector Craddock found himself confronting a case that had evolved from apparent simplicity to bewildering complexity. Mrs. Cartwright's systematic deception was now clear, but her motive for murder remained questionable. She had more to gain from a living investigator who might expose Reginald's crimes than from a dead one whose findings would remain incomplete. Sarah's involvement introduced an entirely different set of possibilities. A daughter who had initiated an investigation into her own father's conduct, who possessed both the artistic skills and the intimate family knowledge necessary to stage an elaborate crime scene, and who stood to inherit a substantial fortune if the family's reputation could be preserved. Such a person might well consider murder a reasonable solution to an increasingly complicated situation. Miss Marple, walking home through the village streets as evening approached, reflected on the peculiar nature of crimes that arose from the intersection of love and greed, justice and revenge. The most dangerous criminals, in her considerable experience, were often those who convinced themselves that their actions served a higher moral purpose. And in a case where multiple parties had compelling reasons to wish Mr. Ashton dead, the truth would likely prove more complex than any single theory of guilt or innocence. The umbrella, with its carefully crafted message, remained the key to understanding not just who had committed murder, but why they had chosen to announce their crime so boldly. In Miss Marple's methodical mind, the answer lay somewhere in the tangled relationships between past grievances and present desperation, between the woman who had returned seeking justice and the daughter who had summoned it. The final revelation, she suspected, would prove that the most carefully laid plans often contained the seeds of their own destruction. The morning brought Inspector Craddock to Upper Thornfield with the methodical determination of a man who had learned that murder investigations, like village gossip, required patient excavation of layers beneath the surface. His return to Thornfield House found the family in a state of nervous expectation, as if they had spent the night rehearsing conversations they hoped never to have. The daughter's burden. Sarah Thornberry received them in the morning room, where her easel held a half-finished miniature. Delicate harebells rendered with the sort of precise brushwork that spoke to years of artistic training. Her confession, when it came, was delivered with the careful composure of someone who had wrestled with conscience and found resolution. "I typed that letter to the trustees," she said without preamble, her hands steady as she cleaned her brushes with methodical precision. I couldn't bear the thought that Mother's legacy might be built on dishonesty. After her death, I began to notice discrepancies. Valuable pieces from her jewelry collection disappearing, signatures on bank documents that didn't quite match her usual hand. Inspector Craddock leaned forward with professional interest. "You had access to your father's typewriter? The old Underwood has been in the family for decades. Everyone uses it for correspondence, parish notices, even my own essays for the local historical society." Sarah's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications of her admission. I waited until Father was visiting tenants, typed the letter carefully, and posted it from Millfield to avoid local speculation. Miss Marple, who had been examining the miniature with apparent admiration, noted the quality of Sarah's brushwork and the meticulous attention to detail that characterized both her art and her confession. "Such delicate work," she observed gently. "The sort that requires not just skill, but infinite patience." The companion's revenge, Mrs. Cartwright, or Miss Vivian Hale as she had once been, abandoned her pose of genteel widowhood when confronted with the evidence of her deception. Her true story emerged with the bitter clarity of long-suppressed grievance. "I returned to Upper Thornfield because justice had been denied," she declared, her carefully maintained composure giving way to genuine anger. "Reginald Thornbury systematically plundered Eleanor's estate during her final illness, forging signatures and selling family heirlooms while she lay dying. When I tried to warn her, she was too frail to understand, too devoted to believe her husband capable of such betrayal. Her account of the umbrella incident at the fete was precise and damaging. Sarah offered me ribbon to repair my umbrella strap, even tied it herself with that artistic flair she brings to everything. But when the rain started and Mr. Thornbury gallantly offered his umbrella, I accepted it readily. My own umbrella, the one Sarah had just mended, remained by the tent entrance, forgotten in the confusion. The investigator's method. The discovery of Mr. Ashton's appointment diary, hidden in his room at the Rose and Crown, revealed the systematic nature of his investigation. The leather-bound book contained entries that painted a picture of methodical inquiry. Meetings with R.T., S.T., even M.F., Dr. Fielding, as he gathered evidence from every possible source. The final entry proved most significant. Thursday, 2:30 p.m. Final meeting with VH, documentary evidence promised. He was thorough, Inspector Craddock observed, studying the precise handwriting. Every interview documented, every lead followed. The sort of investigator who would never destroy evidence before presenting his final report. Miss Marple examined the diary with particular interest, noting not just its contents, but the care with which it had been maintained. A methodical man indeed, the sort who would have brought documentary proof to support his conclusions, yet no such evidence was found with his body. The physical evidence. Dr. Fielding's medical training proved invaluable when he mentioned a detail that had troubled him since the discovery of the body. Mr. Ashton had a small stain on his jacket cuff, he reported to Inspector Craddock. A faint blue smudge that I initially thought was ink, but the consistency was wrong. More like pigment, the sort used in fine art. This observation, combined with Miss Marple's careful examination of Sarah's painting supplies, revealed traces of the same distinctive blue that had been used to dye the ribbon repair on the umbrella. The connection between the artistic materials and the crime scene evidence was becoming undeniably clear. The pattern emerges. As Inspector Craddock pieced together the various testimonies and physical evidence, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The umbrella with its carefully crafted bow had been deliberately placed at the crime scene, but the artistic skill that created the original repair was not the same hand that had retied it so clumsily beside the body. Miss Marple, walking through the village that evening, reflected on the peculiar nature of crimes that arose from the intersection of justice and revenge, love and greed. The most dangerous criminals, in her considerable experience, were often those who convinced themselves that their actions served a higher moral purpose. The umbrella remained the key to understanding not just who had committed murder, but why they had chosen to announce their crime so boldly. Someone had wanted the artistic connection to be discovered, had deliberately planted evidence that would point toward Sarah's involvement while concealing their own role in the tragedy. The gathering storm. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the missing documentary evidence that Mr. Ashton had promised to share with his killer. A portfolio containing proof of financial fraud, signatures analysis, perhaps even photographs of forged documents. Evidence that someone had been desperate enough to kill for, yet careful enough to stage the crime to implicate another. The truth, she suspected, lay not in the obvious motives of revenge or self-preservation, but in the more complex psychology of someone who understood how to manipulate both evidence and suspicion. The final revelation would require one more careful test of human nature, one more opportunity to observe how people behaved when confronted with the consequences of their carefully laid plans. Tomorrow, she decided, would bring the resolution that Upper Thornfield needed, and perhaps deserved. Upper Thornfield wore the brittle cheerfulness of a village attempting normalcy, while secrets pressed against every conversation like steam against a kettle lid. The morning brought Inspector Craddock back to his temporary headquarters with the methodical determination of a man who understood that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful. Miss Marple, taking her customary walk through streets that seemed to whisper with unspoken knowledge, reflected that murder investigations, like village gossip, had a way of revealing far more than anyone intended. The bell tower's secret. It was young Tommy Hartwell who provided the morning's crucial development, arriving at the Rose and Crown with a sort of breathless excitement that immediately commanded attention. His discovery in St. Dunstan's bell tower, a bundle wedged behind, the ladder where only someone familiar with the church's hidden spaces would think to look, transformed the investigation's landscape entirely. The bundle, when carefully retrieved by Inspector Craddock, contained 3 items that seemed to mock the neat theories that had been forming. A leather portfolio scorched at the edges but still clasped shut, a dove-gray kid glove stained with traces of blue pigment, and a black umbrella bearing a silver nameplate engraved with the initials RT. Most significantly, the umbrella's strap bore a length of blue ribbon tied in a distinctly clumsy knot, quite different from the elegant bow that Sarah Thornbury had crafted at the fete. Miss Marple examined each item with the careful attention of someone who understood that physical evidence, like human behavior, often told stories their discoverers never intended. The portfolio's scorched edges suggested a hasty attempt at destruction, interrupted perhaps by panic or the arrival of unexpected witnesses. The glove, clearly expensive and well-maintained, bore the sort of blue staining that spoke to contact with artistic materials. Yet it was the right-hand glove, while the staining pattern suggested left-handed use. The soot tells its story. Inspector Craddock's methodical examination revealed additional details that complicated rather than clarified the emerging picture. When Miss Marple gently pressed her handkerchief against the umbrella's silver nameplate, it came away marked with a distinctive smudge of soot, not the fine dust of ordinary handling, but the coarser residue of coal burning that characterized the church's temperamental boiler system. "The bell ropes don't carry soot," observed the verger when questioned about access to the tower. "But anyone passing through the boiler room on a damp day when I've had to light the furnace early would pick up traces on their hands and clothing." This observation led to a careful examination of who possessed keys to both the tower and the boiler room. The list was surprisingly extensive. The verger himself, Reverend Hartwell, Colonel Weatherby, who had borrowed keys the previous week to inspect structural damage, and Dr. Fielding, who occasionally assisted with bell ringing for special services. A gathering of suspects. Miss Marple suggested a small gathering at the Rose and Crown to return personal effects and clarify remaining questions. the sort of civilized meeting that allowed careful observation of reactions without the formal pressure of police interrogation. The assembled company included all the principal figures: Mrs. Cartwright maintaining her careful composure, Sarah Thornbury pale but determined, Reginald Thornbury blustering with wounded dignity, Colonel Weatherby relieved but watchful, and Dr. Fielding nervous in the particular way of someone who understood more than he had admitted. The umbrella dominated the conversation, its journey from Reginald's possession to Mrs. Cartwright's temporary use to its final appearance at the crime scene, creating a complex chain of custody that implicated multiple parties while exonerating none. Mrs. Cartwright's admission that she had accepted Reginald's umbrella while leaving her own, the one Sarah had just mended, by the tent entrance seemed straightforward enough. Yet the umbrella found with Mr. Ashton bore Reginald's initials while displaying Sarah's artistic handiwork. The portfolio's secrets. The damaged portfolio yielded fragments of Mr. Ashton's investigation that painted an increasingly complex picture of financial irregularities spanning several years. Bank statements showing unusual withdrawals during Mrs. Thornbury's final illness. Receipts for jewelry sales that family members claimed never to have authorized, and most damning of all, handwriting samples that suggested systematic forgery of the invalid's signature on important documents. Yet crucial pages were missing, burned beyond recovery, or perhaps hidden elsewhere. The investigation that had brought Mr. Ashton to Upper Thornfield remained incomplete, its most significant conclusions destroyed by someone who understood exactly which evidence posed the greatest threat to their carefully constructed deceptions. Miss Marple's growing understanding. As the afternoon progressed and the various testimonies revealed their inconsistencies, Miss Marple found herself focusing on the psychological rather than the physical evidence. The careful staging of the crime scene, the deliberate placement of clues that pointed in multiple directions, the sophisticated understanding of how an investigation would proceed, all suggested a mind that was both calculating and desperate, methodical yet driven by powerful emotions. The blue ribbon remained central to her thinking, not just as evidence, but as a message. Someone had wanted the artistic connection to be discovered, had deliberately created a trail that led back to Sarah's innocent assistance with umbrella repairs. Yet that same someone had been careful to disguise their own handiwork, retying the elegant bow in a clumsy knot that suggested masculine hands, while preserving enough of the original evidence to ensure discovery. The pattern emerges. Walking back to her great-niece's cottage as evening approached, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of crimes that arose from the intersection of multiple motives and opportunities. The murder of Mr. Ashton had clearly been planned by someone who understood both the village's social dynamics and the likely course of a police investigation. The killer had anticipated how suspicion would fall, had prepared evidence to guide that suspicion in desired directions, and had shown remarkable sang-froid in executing a complex deception under the pressure of a public gathering. Yet even the most carefully laid plans contained the seeds of their own destruction. The soot on the umbrella handle, the mismatched gloves, the scorched portfolio hidden where it would eventually be found, all spoke to a mind that was clever enough to plan murder, but human enough to make the small mistakes that would ultimately lead to exposure. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, would bring the final test of her growing understanding. The killer had shown remarkable skill in manipulating evidence and directing suspicion, but human nature, in her considerable experience, always revealed itself when confronted with the consequences of its own actions. The truth of what had happened in the gardener's shed, and why, lay not in the physical evidence alone, but in the complex web of relationships and secrets that bound Upper Thornfield's residents together in ways they had never intended to reveal. The umbrella, with its carefully crafted message, would indeed provide the key to justice, though perhaps not in the way its manipulator had planned. In Miss Marple's methodical mind, the final revelation was taking shape. A truth that would prove both simpler and more complex than any of the theories that had dominated the investigation thus far. The morning brought Inspector Craddock back to Upper Thornfield with the methodical determination of a man who had learned that the most complex deceptions often unraveled through the simplest observations. Miss Marple, who had requested one final gathering at the Rose and Crown's private parlor, arranged her knitting materials with the careful precision of someone preparing for a delicate experiment in human psychology. The final assembly. The assembled company, Mrs. Cartwright, Sarah, and Reginald Thornbury, Colonel Weatherby and Dr. Fielding, settled themselves with the careful politeness of people who understood they were participating in something far more significant than a social gathering. Miss Marple had specifically requested that certain items be present: the recovered umbrella with its telltale blue ribbon, the scorched portfolio from the bell tower, and the single dove-gray glove that had revealed so much about its wearer's habits. Inspector Craddock began by methodically reviewing the evidence that had accumulated over the past several days. The umbrella found beside Mr. Ashton's body bore Reginald Thornbury's initials, yet its ribbon repair showed two distinctly different tying techniques. First, the elegant bow that Sarah had crafted at the fete, then a clumsy knot that suggested hasty retying by different hands. The portfolio's scorched edges indicated a desperate attempt at destruction, while the missing pages suggested someone who knew exactly which evidence posed the greatest threat. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and began her gentle interrogation with the sort of innocent observation that had served her well in previous encounters with carefully concealed guilt. It's remarkable how much our small habits reveal about us, isn't it? The way we tie knots, handle delicate objects, even the unconscious preferences that guide our daily actions. The psychological pressure. She turned her attention to the umbrella, allowing each person to examine it closely while maintaining a steady stream of seemingly casual observations. Dr. Fielding, your medical training has made you particularly observant about such detail. You were the one who noticed that the original bow was tied by right-handed manipulation, while the later knot showed left-handed characteristics. Dr. Fielding's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, a tiny sound that Miss Marple's trained ear caught immediately. His face had taken on the pallor of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble. Medical training, Miss Marple continued with apparent casualness, provides such excellent preparation for understanding both human anatomy and investigative procedures. Doctors learn to observe symptoms, follow logical chains of evidence, anticipate how colleagues will interpret findings. They also develop the sort of precise motor control and steady hand that comes from years of delicate procedures. Inspector Craddock, following Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated plan, produced Mr. Ashton's notebook and began reading selected passages. The investigator's methodical documentation revealed his growing suspicion that someone with medical knowledge had been assisting in forging Mrs. Thornbury's signature during her final illness. Someone whose surgical training provided the necessary precision for convincing document manipulation. The evidence converges. Miss Marple leaned forward with gentle determination, her knitting needles pausing in their rhythm. Dr. Fielding, I believe you've been carrying a terrible burden of guilt and fear. When you first arrived in Upper Thornfield to take over Dr. Pemberton's practice, you were young, newly qualified, perhaps struggling with the debts that medical training inevitably brings. When Reginald approached you with what seemed like harmless requests to help an invalid manage her affairs, she allowed the implication to hang in the air before continuing. The requests gradually escalated, didn't they? From innocent assistance with Eleanor's correspondence to more complex document signing. Your medical knowledge made you invaluable for creating convincing forgeries, and your fear of exposure trapped you in an increasingly dangerous web of complicity. Dr. Fielding's hands gripped his medical bag with white-knuckled intensity, but he remained silent, his professional composure warring with mounting psychological pressure. Miss Marple picked up the dove-grey glove, examining it with a sort of attention that made everyone in the room acutely aware of its significance. This glove tells such an interesting story. Expensive, well-maintained, clearly belonging to someone who values quality. Yet the blue staining on its palm suggests it was used by someone left-handed, despite being a right-hand glove. Rather awkward, really, unless one was in such haste that proper attention to such details became impossible. The trap springs. The church keys, Miss Marple observed, consulting her notes with deliberate care, show traces of the same distinctive soot that marked Mr. Ashton's umbrella handle. The verger mentioned that anyone passing through the boiler room on damp days when the furnace was lit early would pick up such traces. You occasionally assisted with bell ringing for special services, didn't you, Doctor? The psychological pressure proved too much for Dr. Fielding's carefully maintained composure. His confession, when it finally came, was delivered with the sort of clinical precision that characterized his professional manner, as if he were diagnosing his own moral failure. "I never intended for anyone to be hurt," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his admission. "When Reginald first approached me about Eleanor's condition, he presented the signature assistance as a medical necessity. She was so frail, barely conscious, unable to manage even the simplest correspondence. I told myself I was helping a devoted husband care for his dying wife. The complete truth, the full story, emerged with painful clarity. Dr. Fielding's initial involvement had been relatively innocent, helping an invalid woman manage necessary paperwork during her final illness. But Reginald Thornbury's requests had gradually escalated to systematic fraud, exploiting the young doctor's medical expertise and growing fear of exposure to create an increasingly elaborate deception. When Mr. Ashton arrived and began asking questions about handwriting analysis and medical expertise, I knew it was only a matter of time before he connected me to the forgeries. I tried to convince him that I had been an unwilling participant, manipulated by desperate circumstances, but he was determined to include everything in his report to the trustees. The murder itself had been born of panic rather than calculation. The meeting in the gardener's shed had been arranged under the pretense of providing additional medical evidence about Mrs. Thornbury's condition during her final illness. When Ashton refused to suppress the medical evidence that would implicate Dr. Fielding in the forgeries, desperation had overcome professional restraint. "I struck him with a gardening implement in a moment of terror," Dr. Fielding admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then I realized what I had done, and the elaborate staging seemed like the only way to direct suspicion away from myself. I knew how investigations proceeded, how evidence would be interpreted. I thought if I could make it appear that someone else had killed him to prevent exposure of the financial crimes, no one would look for medical connections." Miss Marple's reflection. As Inspector Craddock formally arrested Dr. Fielding, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of a case where the desire to heal had been corrupted into the willingness to harm. The young doctor's medical oath to first do no harm had been abandoned in favor of self-preservation, leading inevitably to the ultimate harm of murder. The umbrella with its carefully crafted message had indeed provided the key to justice, revealing not just the killer's attempt to manipulate evidence, but the very skills and knowledge that made the deception possible. The blue ribbon, tied first with artistic precision by Sarah's innocent hands, and then retied clumsily by desperate medical fingers, had told the complete story of how trust could be betrayed and how professional competence could be turned to criminal purpose. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction, always found a way to reveal itself, no matter how carefully it tried to hide behind respectability and social position. The rain that had disrupted the St. Dunstan's church fete had washed away more than mere footprints. It had ultimately cleansed Upper Thornfield of the deception and violence that had poisoned its tranquil surface. As the village began the slow process of healing from wounds that secrets and betrayal had inflicted, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her great-niece's cottage, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed. The umbrella beneath which murder had sheltered would trouble Upper Thornfield's dreams no more. The week following Dr. Fielding's arrest settled over Upper Thornfield like the peculiar quiet that follows a violent thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath while assessing the damage. Miss Marple, seated by her great-niece's cottage window with her knitting, observed that the village moved with the careful deliberation of people who had learned that appearances could deceive in the most fundamental ways. The young doctor who had delivered their children and tended their ailments had proven capable of both systematic fraud and calculated murder, a revelation that shook the very foundations of trust upon which small communities depend. The practical consequences. Inspector Craddock's methodical documentation revealed the full extent of the deception that had poisoned the village's tranquil surface. Dr. Fielding's confession opened floodgates of evidence painting a disturbing picture of how professional competence could be corrupted by desperation and fear. The forgeries he had created during Mrs. Eleanor Thornberry's final illness were masterful examples of medical precision applied to criminal purpose, signatures that matched the trembling hand of an invalid so perfectly that even banking officials had accepted them without question. The brass nameplate bearing Dr. Fielding's name was quietly removed from the surgery, draped in brown paper like a wound that required gentle covering. Patients who had blessed his steadiness only days before now crossed the street with averted eyes, their faith in medical authority severely shaken. The practical business of finding a replacement would prove challenging, as whoever eventually took over the practice would face the difficult task of rebuilding confidence that had been so thoroughly undermined. Reginald Thornberry, confronted with irrefutable evidence of his manipulation of both his dying wife and the young doctor who had trusted him, finally abandoned his pose of wounded dignity. The trustees arrived with briefcases and a vocabulary of consequences. There would be restitution, possible prosecution, and the dismantling of a carefully constructed facade that had hidden years of systematic fraud. He moved about Thornfield House like a man negotiating unfamiliar corridors in his own home, his former bluster replaced by the hollow resignation of someone who no longer believed his own justifications. Sarah's moral burden. Sarah Thornberry bore perhaps the heaviest emotional burden of all. Her role in exposing her father's crimes through the anonymous letter had been motivated by genuine moral conviction, but the weight of unintended consequences pressed heavily upon her conscience. Miss Marple found her in the church garden one afternoon, tending the graves with methodical attention that suggested a need for meaningful activity in the face of overwhelming guilt. "I keep thinking that if I hadn't sent that letter, Mr. Ashton would still be alive," Sarah confided, her voice carrying the particular pain of someone who understood that good intentions could lead to tragic outcomes. Dr. Fielding might never have felt desperate enough to commit murder if the investigation hadn't threatened to expose his involvement. Miss Marple settled herself on a nearby bench, regarding the young woman with gentle understanding. "My dear, you cannot hold yourself responsible for the criminal choices that others made in response to your moral courage. The fraud was already committed, the deception already in place. Your letter simply ensured that truth would eventually emerge, as it always does when fundamental dishonesty has taken root." Sarah's decision to renounce her inheritance entirely, donating the trust fund to charitable causes rather than accept money obtained through her father's betrayal, spoke to the principled character that had motivated her original action. "I shall give my inheritance to time," she told Miss Marple with quiet determination. "Use it to put things right slowly. It seems the only way to be certain of the knots we tie." Mrs. Cartwright's vindication. The resolution brought unexpected vindication for Mrs. Cartwright, or Miss Vivian Hale as she had once been. Her return to Upper Thornfield under false pretenses had been motivated by genuine desire for justice rather than personal revenge. and Dr. Fielding's confession confirmed her original allegations about financial irregularities during Mrs. Thornberry's final illness. I spent 6 years believing that no one would listen to the truth simply because of my social position, she told Miss Marple during a final visit before departing the village. The irony is that my elaborate deception in returning here was unnecessary. The evidence would have emerged eventually through proper legal channels. Her departure was as quiet as her arrival had been calculated, leaving behind only the faintest ripple in the village's collective memory. The London train took her away with its practical hiss, carrying with it a small cloud of pity that would linger and complicate every future retelling of the story. The village's recovery. Colonel Weatherby's relief at being cleared of suspicion was tempered by genuine distress about his unwitting role in the deception. His military bearing could not quite conceal his embarrassment at having been so thoroughly fooled by both Dr. Fielding's apparent respectability and Mrs. Cartwright's carefully constructed persona. Spent 30 years learning to read men's characters under battlefield conditions, he confided to Miss Marple. Rather humbling to discover that a village doctor and a lady writing about gardens could deceive me so completely. The St. Dunstan's Church fete would forever be remembered not for its charitable success, but as the day when murder shattered the village's tranquil surface. The marquees were folded and carted away, the bunting dried and boxed, leaving only a rectangular bruise on the grass that would take time to fade. Mrs. Ashworth spoke of reimagining next year's event entirely, though Miss Marple suspected the shadow of recent events would linger for many seasons. The Reverend Dr. Hartwell preached a sermon on things done in secret being proclaimed from housetops, speaking of duties owed, of kindness that was not indulgence, and of justice that was not mere appetite. His words contained more warmth than his usual theological minutiae, which made it very good indeed. Mrs. Hartwell counted the collection with brisk satisfaction and sent baskets of cold ham to the police, because righteousness and sandwiches were not mutually exclusive. Miss Marple's final reflections. As Inspector Craddock prepared to depart, he took tea with Miss Marple one last afternoon. "I had a handsome case against the Colonel," he admitted, setting his cup down with care. "You unpicked it with a length of ribbon." "Not I," Miss Marple replied with gentle precision. "Human nature did that. Men who like uniforms also like to be seen as useful. Young doctors, however brave their aspirations, are easily frightened when the thing they are proudest of, their steadiness, turns traitor." Walking to the churchyard gate, Miss Marple paused at the umbrella stand inside the church porch. She withdrew a frayed length of blue ribbon from her bag and, with neat, unhurried fingers, retied the strap of an old black umbrella that had seen better days. The bough sat squarely, neither vain nor careless, a small act of restoration that seemed to carry larger significance. The case had revealed the particular dangers that arose when professional competence was corrupted by desperation and fear. Dr. Fielding's medical training had made him uniquely valuable to Reginald Thornberry's fraudulent schemes, but it had also provided him with the knowledge and steady hand necessary to stage an elaborate crime scene designed to mislead investigators. Yet even the most carefully laid plans contained the seeds of their own destruction: the soot on the umbrella handle, the mismatched gloves, the artistic precision that betrayed itself through its very excellence. The restoration of peace. Upper Thornfield returned as villages do to the business of living. The gossip softened into stories, the stories into warnings told kindly. The rain, when it came next, met a forest of umbrellas whose straps held firm. The rectangular bruise on the village green gradually faded, and children once again played where the refreshment tent had stood. Miss Marple, her blue bed jacket finally completed, prepared to return to her own village. She carried with her the quiet satisfaction of justice served and truth revealed, though she understood that the real work of healing would continue long after the official investigation had concluded. The umbrella beneath which murder had sheltered would trouble Upper Thornfield's dreams no more. but the lessons it had taught about the fragility of trust and the complexity of human nature would endure in the collective memory of a community that had learned to look more carefully beneath the surface of even the most respectable appearances. Human nature, she reflected with that mixture of sadness and satisfaction that characterized all her encounters with crime, always found ways to reveal itself, no matter how carefully it tried to hide behind respectability and social position. The rain that had disrupted the church fete had ultimately washed away more than mere footprints. It had cleansed Upper Thornfield of the deception and violence that had poisoned its tranquil surface, leaving behind a community that was perhaps wiser, if somewhat more wary, than it had been before. As her train departed from the village station, Miss Marple counted stitches in her finished work as if they were the ordinary, blessed beats of a heart set right. Time, she had told Sarah, was an excellent trustee. It would rain again in Upper Thornfield, but the village would be ready with sound umbrellas and properly tied knots. Lessons learned through sorrow, but held with the determination that comes from understanding the true cost of trust betrayed and truth revealed. The October morning brought Miss Marple a collection of letters that arrived with the sort of quiet significance that marks the true conclusion of any complex affair. Seated at her cottage window in St. Mary Mead, with the blue bed jacket folded neatly beside her teacup, she reflected that correspondence often provided the most honest accounting of how lives reconstructed themselves after crisis had passed. The correspondence of resolution, Sarah Thornberry's letter, written in the precise hand that had once crafted delicate miniatures, carried news both practical and profound. The trustees had formally accepted her renunciation of the inheritance, directing the substantial sum toward establishing a district nursing service and educational scholarships for young women of steady character and steadier principles. "I find," Sarah had written, "that giving away tainted money proves remarkably liberating. The village school has offered me a permanent position teaching art and literature, work that feels honest in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Her father, Sarah reported with characteristic directness, had accepted a modest flat near his solicitor's chambers in the county town, where his days were occupied with the tedious business of restitution and reckoning. The legal proceedings had concluded without criminal charges, though the social consequences had proven more enduring than any court sentence might have been. Reginald Thornberry had become a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms throughout the district, a reminder that respectability, once lost through systematic deception, could never be entirely reclaimed. Mrs. Cartwright, or Miss Vivian Hale, as she had resumed calling herself, had written from London on expensive cream paper that carried the faint scent of orris root. Her position with a charitable organization specializing in elder care supervision had proven both meaningful and redemptive, allowing her to channel her desire for justice into constructive rather than vengeful purposes. "I was foolish to think revenge could be mended like an umbrella strap," she had written with characteristic precision. "Justice, when it comes properly, is plainer, workmanlike, and does not call attention to its bow." The village's institutional recovery, Inspector Craddock's official report, delivered with his characteristic blend of thoroughness and dry humor, confirmed that Dr. Marcus Fielding had been sentenced to 15 years' imprisonment for murder and conspiracy to defraud. The proceedings had been conducted with dignity rather than sensationalism, focusing on the methodical presentation of evidence rather than the dramatic circumstances of the crime's discovery. His medical license had been permanently revoked, ensuring that his particular combination of professional skill and moral weakness could never again threaten vulnerable patients. Dr. Margaret Ashworth, no relation to the formidable Mrs. Cordelia, had assumed the village practice with the sort of brisk competence that gradually restored confidence in medical authority. A woman of 50-odd years, with steel-gray hair and an uncompromising manner, she possessed the particular gift of inspiring trust through sheer professional capability rather than charm. Her first official act had been conducting a complete audit of patient records, ensuring that no trace of Dr. Fielding's deceptions remained to compromise future care. The brass nameplate outside the surgery now bore her name in letters that seemed somehow more permanent than those that had preceded them. Patients approached with initial wariness, but gradually returned to comfortable routines, though conversations in the waiting room still carried undercurrents of caution about placing too much faith in professional appearances alone. Colonel Weatherby's renewed purpose. Colonel Weatherby had thrown himself into village affairs with the determination of a man seeking to prove his worth after being so thoroughly deceived by carefully constructed facades. His military experience proved invaluable in organizing the Autumn Harvest Festival, where his logistical skills ensured proper management of every detail without the chaos that had characterized the ill-fated church fete. His friendship with the new doctor had developed along lines of mutual respect rather than romantic interest, both having learned to value competence over charm. Their weekly chess games at the Rose and Crown had become a fixture of village life, providing a model of how trust could be rebuilt through consistent, honorable behavior rather than grand gestures or elaborate explanations. Memorial and remembrance. Mrs. Whitmore had quietly established a memorial corner in the Rose and Crown's public room, displaying a framed photograph of Mr. Geoffrey Ashton alongside a brief inscription acknowledging his dedication to truth and justice. The gesture served as both tribute and warning, a reminder that the pursuit of honesty sometimes required courage that could prove fatal, but remained essential to the functioning of civilized society. The church had instituted a new tradition during Sunday services, a moment of silent reflection before the final blessing, during which congregants were invited to consider the difference between appearance and reality, between the face one showed the world and the truth one carried in private moments. The Reverend Dr. Hartwell had found his theological voice in addressing these themes, delivering sermons that combined scholarly insight with practical wisdom about the complexities of human nature. The umbrella's legacy. The umbrella stand in the church porch had been quietly replaced, though the old black umbrella with its blue ribbon repair had been preserved in the vestry as a reminder of how small details could reveal large truths. The parish council had voted to purchase new umbrella stands for both the church and the inn, with hooks properly spaced to prevent future confusion of ownership, a practical measure that carried symbolic weight for those who understood its significance. Miss Marple had learned from her great-niece that visitors occasionally inquired about the preserved umbrella's meaning, leading to conversations about the importance of paying attention to inconsistencies and trusting one's observations even when they challenged comfortable assumptions. The blue ribbon, once a symbol of innocent assistance, then desperate misdirection, and finally silent witness to desperate crime, had become an emblem of how ordinary objects could carry extraordinary significance when viewed with proper attention. Miss Marple's final reflections. As autumn deepened and the first frost touched her cottage garden, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the particular dangers that arose when professional competence was corrupted by desperation and fear. Dr. Fielding's medical training had made him uniquely valuable to Reginald Thornberry's fraudulent schemes, but it had also provided him with the knowledge and steady hand necessary to stage an elaborate crime scene designed to mislead investigators. The case had demonstrated once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, who understood how society functioned well enough to manipulate its assumptions and expectations. Yet it had also shown that human nature, no matter how carefully concealed, always found ways to reveal itself through the small inconsistencies and telling details that careful observation could detect. Walking to her own garden gate that evening, Miss Marple paused to examine the umbrella stand by her door. She withdrew a length of blue ribbon from her work basket and retied the strap of an old black umbrella with neat, unhurried fingers. The bows sat squarely, neither ostentatious nor careless. a small act of restoration that seemed to carry larger significance about the patient work of mending what had been damaged by deception and violence. The enduring peace. Upper Thornfield had learned to live with the knowledge that trust, once broken, required patient rebuilding through consistent action rather than mere words. The village moved forward with the cautious wisdom of a community that had confronted the darkness beneath its tranquil surface and emerged stronger, if somewhat more wary, than it had been before. The rain, when it fell on the village green, no longer carried associations with violence and deception. Children played where the refreshment tent had stood, their laughter a testament to the healing power of time and the resilience of communities committed to truth and justice. The rectangular bruise on the grass had faded entirely, though the lessons learned during those rain-soaked hours would endure in the collective memory of a village that had discovered the importance of looking carefully beneath the surface of even the most respectable appearances. Miss Marple, counting stitches in a new knitting project as if they were the ordinary, blessed beats of a heart set right, reflected that justice, like needlework, was ultimately a matter of patience, precision, and the willingness to unravel mistakes in order to create something both beautiful and enduring. The pattern would hold, the stitches would remain secure, and Upper Thornfield would continue its quiet work of being a place where truth mattered more than convenience, and where the careful observation of human nature served the cause of justice rather than mere curiosity. Human nature, she had learned through decades of gentle detection, always found ways to reveal itself, no matter how carefully it tried to hide behind respectability and social position. The umbrella beneath which murder had sheltered would trouble no more dreams, but the wisdom it had taught about the fragility of trust and the complexity of human motivations would endure as long as people gathered in villages, tied ribbons with varying degrees of skill, and carried the eternal capacity for both great kindness and terrible betrayal within their seemingly ordinary hearts. The mystery of Upper Thornfield had reached its proper conclusion, not with dramatic revelation alone, but with the patient work of restoration that follows every storm, when communities must learn again how to trust wisely while remaining alert to the small signs that reveal when that trust might be misplaced. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, this was perhaps the most important lesson of all, that the end of one mystery always marked the beginning of the next quiet vigil, watching and waiting for the moment when human nature would once again reveal its secrets to those patient enough to notice and wise enough to understand.